Why do people like horror movies so much? I mean, yeah, they're cheap entertainment and they can be fun with friends, but if you spend any amount of time around people who like horror movies, you'll notice that they really like horror movies to an almost unhealthy degree. Why is that? Okay, despite being a YouTuber, I'm not so narcissistic as to pretend I can speak for anyone other than myself. People have tons of unique personal reasons for enjoying the things they do, but it is undeniable that genre fiction, like horror, like sci-fi, fantasy, and even erotica, has always attracted strong and passionate fans. Because, for as much as people love to complain about tropes, it's those exact tropes, those building blocks, that create the playground which allows artists to get freaky with it. And let's just say that horror media has been getting freaky with it for a very long time. And while I'd love to get all intellectual and talk about the finer psychological elements of horror, or whatever people mean when they say elevated horror, the truth is that for every slow burn masterpiece that redefines the genre, there's like 5 dogshit Leprechaun sequels, which is simply a natural side effect of this type of media being so profitable and cheap to make. It appeals heavily to the Normans, leading generations of critics, and even some people I respect, to label most horror media as trash. And I kinda can't blame them. I mean, have you seen some of this shit? Even as a self-proclaimed fan, I barely engage with the genre nowadays, aside from playing the occasional game or whatever. But that's okay, it's still in my blood. I know what I am. Let me explain. I spent 100% of my early childhood absolutely pulverizing my brain with unrestricted access to the internet, reading creepypastas, playing weird games, clicking links I shouldn't have, and staying up way past my bedtime. This really was the origin point for a lot of things I talk about on this channel. What started as a weird experiment has sort of become a way for me to reconnect with all the niche things that caught my eye as a kid. Like a lot of Gen Z people, I eventually became pretty passive about my own interests, not really seeking out things like I used to back in the day, lulled by algorithms and secondhand opinions. Well, I eventually got tired of that, and for a while now I've been trying to be passionate again, to be the obsessive little freak I know I can be, even if I've kind of stumbled a lot in the process. And dumb video essay shit aside, this stuff does mean a lot to me. Not only did I obsess over it, but it was something I shared with my family. So beyond expanding my knowledge, it's a way of reconnecting with that part of myself. I don't know, man. I just want to be honest with everyone. For as much as YouTubers, myself included, tend to speak in an authoritative tone, I'm really just following my heart here. These videos are as much of a learning experience for me as they might be for you. And in my little journey to reconnect with my passions, I ended up getting back into horror movies. Japanese horror movies. Not only because I largely ignored them for most of my life, but because, well, I don't know how else to say this, but I guess this is a channel for weeaboos now. I promise that was not my intention when I started, but in trying to follow my interests, I ended up realizing that I was a raging weeb in ways I could not have predicted. Which means that I just spent the better part of 5 months blasting my retinas with kinda weird and somewhat obscure J-horror. Yeah, remember when J-horror was all the rage back in 2005? Remember the cursed videos, the haunted phone calls, and creepy ghost girls? Remember the Fishmen? Wait, what's that? You don't remember the Fishmen? Well, we all start somewhere. God, this intro's a mess. Is this what writers mean by taking too long to introduce the subject? Okay, I'll be using the term J-horror pretty liberally throughout this video, but it would be a good idea to point out that J-horror is a pretty narrow label that mainly stems from the 90s and 2000s. It doesn't really encompass all of Japanese horror film as a whole. I know. Way to bring down the mood, you nerd. But it's true. People's perception of Japanese horror has certainly expanded a lot in the last few years, but somewhere deep down there's still that stereotype about girls with long black hair and curses and stuff. From my understanding, J-horror kind of emerged as this American label aimed at all the Japanese horror movies that were getting imported in the early 2000s. This is pretty obvious when you look at the big fat J in front of J-horror. I mean, Americans aren't calling their own TV shows A-dramas. A bunch of these Japanese tapes landed in the hands of Hollywood producers who were looking for new blood to revitalize their IP. It's safe to say that American horror movies had gotten pretty stale at this point, mainly relying on remakes of franchises that were really showing their age. Like, for real, does anyone like any of these movies? Oh, wow. Of course the guy who directed The Ring is called Gore Verbinski. I mean, who else would you get? Wait, his actual name is Gregor? And he directed Rango? The Ring made a lot of money, enough money to fund a ton of other remakes. This created a symbiotic relationship between Japan and America's film industries, where Japanese producers greenlit more and more of this kind of stuff so that it would be bought up by Americans and eventually remade. Like with a lot of trends, this whole thing eventually fizzled out and people began claiming J-horror was dead or something. But I bring all of this up because many of the movies I'll be mentioning here kind of break this J-horror stereotype. While I didn't willingly set out to find the weirdest or most obscure movies, I ended up with some pretty odd picks regardless. Some are pretty well known, but others might be new to you. Who knows? I'll do my best to give some insight into the context behind these movies, but I don't want to blow up the scope of the video too much. There's actually a lot you can dive into when it comes to Japanese horror movies. And it all ties back to the history of Japanese film itself, which all ties back to the history of Japanese theater, World War II, nukes, the American occupation of Japan, the growing divide between tradition and modernity. It's a lot. There's only so much information my brain can process before it just gives up. So, what's first on the list of weird Japanese horror movies, or whatever the fuck I'm calling it? Oh, it's, Ju-on the Grudge? What may be one of the most famous and archetypical pieces of J-horror ever made? Wow, I'm really good at writing these videos, aren't I? No, I'm just fucking with you. I'm actually talking about the original Ju-on here. Before the big theatrical debut of Ju-on the Grudge, Takashi Shimizu made Ju-on. This was their first feature-length appearance of friends of the channel Kayako and Toshio. Oh, look at that little guy. Isn't he so cute? I say first feature-length appearance because their first actual appearance was in the form of 2 short films, Katasumi and... Let me give this a try. 444, 444, 4444, that's 10 fours, were 2 short films featured in the made-for-TV anthology movie Gakko no Kaidan G, which is like School Ghost Stories G in English. The G stands for great! Oh yeah, I guess I did watch this one in preparation for the video. I don't have too much to say about it. I mean, it's not subtitled, but if you like the School Ghost Stories format, you'll probably get something out of it. One of these segments has like a lot of gross eating noises, which were very hard to sit through, but if that sounds fun to you, then knock yourself out. Harnessing the connections he made during his time in film school, Takashi Shimizu got his start where a lot of young directors did back then, V-cinema. Now, what is V-cinema? Wow, you're really putting me on the spot here, but short answer, Japanese straight-to-video movies. Long answer, you see the video part of that? It's the V in OVA. It refers to home video, not live TV or a movie theater, but videos which you buy and play at home at your own discretion. During Japan's economic bubble period, a lot of people bought fancy electronics like VCRs and nice, expensive TVs. This mass adoption of home video technology was the perfect storm for a bunch of smaller-scale film and anime projects to get the green light. Not for the big screen, and not for cable television, but for the enthusiast market. People who'd frequent video rental stores and pick out tapes to watch. This was a huge market, and as you already know, OVAs were quite the cash cow for anime studios. Film companies wanted a slice of that pie, so there were a lot of straight-to-video movies made in the 80s and 90s. As home video evolved, VHS was eventually replaced by DVD, and so on. While the phrase straight-to-video usually conjures up images of like shitty sequels or other garbage nobody wants to watch, V-cinema was actually its own well-respected institution where a lot of famous directors got their start, including Takashi Shimizu with Ju-on from 1999. It's safe to say V Cinema Ju-on and Ju-on the Grudge share a lot in common. They both utilize a form of episodic storytelling. They both have that really slow mood, which focuses on this sense of urban malaise. And they both feature everyone's favorite mom and son duo. Yeah, I really love these two. If you follow me on X, the Everything app, you've probably seen me retweet a bunch of Sadako fan art or whatever, but for the record, I really love Ghost Girls. Not just because I think they're cute, but also because they have a lot of flexibility in terms of storytelling. There's just a really wide range of emotions you can convey with a vengeful female ghost. I know smarter people than me have written entire essays about this shit, so I'm not gonna waste your time here. But yeah, and Kayako brings that distinctly milfy flavor to the archetype that I really appreciate. Wait, I probably shouldn't say that. The way in which the actress contorts and moves around, the expressiveness of her performance, it's also reminiscent of theater to me. It feels very distinctly Japanese. I'm not oblivious as to how unique this must have felt if you grew up exclusively on 80s slasher movies. This is a very unique flavor. As for Toshio, well, I just think he's a cute little guy. He meows like a cat. He also kills people. There's a certain je ne sais quoi to the look and feel of Ju-on the First. Granted, a lot of this has to do with the medium. Ju-on the Grudge is shot on film. It has a cinematic widescreen aspect ratio, and there's a certain level of polish to it. Yeah, the VFX are still simple looking, but it just feels a tad more professional and big in scope. Ju-on 1, on the other hand, owing to its V-cinema roots, is mainly shot on cheaper standard definition digital video. And you can freaking tell, baby. Sure, these are professional cameras and all that, but there's still a certain quality to the motion, the colors and the exposure, which are all telltale signs of a primitive digital video sensor. And since it's in 4:3 and in standard definition, you can see all the little aliasing artifacts and slightly fuzzy edges on objects. Which rules, by the way. This is not a critique. I, like many others, have a very soft spot for digital video. It's actually been really amusing seeing the current nostalgia wave for digital cameras. You know what I'm talking about. Don't act like you don't. I see you nerds shooting your food reviews on mini DV. I know what you are. It's been fun keeping tabs on it because, at the risk of being slightly insufferable, I called it years ago. This happens a lot with this kind of stuff. Nostalgia comes in cycles. For a while, people were all fuzzy-feely about analog video and Super 8 and all that, so it's only natural we'd do the same for 2000s DV. There's just something about Kamen Rider Kuga that hits different, man. Beyond nostalgia, DV, professional and consumer grade alike, just looks cool. In Ju-on, for example, it brings out all these rich colors and gives every space a certain warmth. God, I know how corny that sounds. I genuinely think it helps add to the atmosphere. That's something I really like about Ju-on, more so than Ju-on the Grudge. My first movie feels so mundane. It's not too worried about having any kind of narrative/thematic through line, so you're kind of allowed to simply exist in these spaces as a viewer, without the stress of having to move the plot forward. The mundane environments combined with the casual conversations and liminal spaces induce a warmth in my soul. It's comfy. Yeah, it's also quite creepy, but it feels nice to spend time with this movie as a viewer. Digital video and found footage were massive pillars of late 90s and early 2000s horror. If you're watching this, you probably know about the Blair Witch Project. Needless to say, random people screwing around with a camcorder and running into spooky happenings proved to be quite the popular format. Popular enough to make its way overseas. Noroi the Curse is often regarded as the scariest Japanese found footage movie. But don't let the Blair Witch mention fool you. Noroi is way, way, way different than Blair Witch. For one, while it uses the concept of found footage as a framing device, it's technically a mockumentary, which is itself framed within a fictional TV show which is also a smorgasbord of different spooky broadcasts, news clips, and other stuff. A film about media itself, all chronicling the demise of a certain paranormal investigator. This is director Koji Shiraishi's most famous movie, at least overseas, and for good reason. It's fucking scary, and very creative with its own format. It also incorporates some wild cosmic horror elements that slowly seep in as the film progresses. Put a pin on cosmic horror, by the way. This is a topic we're going to be revisiting quite a bit. I'm not here to talk about Noroi though. Koji Shiraishi is an insanely prolific director in his own right, and his post-Noroi work is fucking nuts. The more I read about this guy, the more I realize he's probably some kind of genius. While I'd consider Takashi Shimizu to be a normal horror director, happy to stay in his lane, Koji Shiraishi is the complete opposite, often slamming headfirst into the constraints of horror, of film itself. He's a man who is not only keenly aware of the exploitative nature of his chosen genre, but openly willing to roast himself for it, often featuring self-inserts that are framed in the most uncharitable, cynical ways possible. It's literally just him in the movie. Furthermore, Koji Shiraishi is often willing to completely subvert the idea of fear, injecting his work with an underlying sense of comedic absurdity. This manifests in subtle ways as you watch his movies. Strange choices, funny lines of dialogue, and eventually, full-on insanity. Little details that clue you into the idea that this guy's having the time of his fucking life. Scaring the hoes. I love him. Nowhere is this overlap of mockumentary horror, baffling directorial choices, and cosmic horror more evident than in Occult. A movie which is kind of like Noroi in that it uses found footage and digital horror to tell a creepy story about a Lovecraftian conspiracy, but also kind of like Ju-on in its usage of mundane liminal space and low-key filmmaking to immerse you. But it's also somehow a movie about Japan's lost decade, homelessness, and terrorism? Yeah. I'm not really gonna give a plot synopsis here, but the general idea is this. A fictionalized Koji Shiraishi and his documentary crew set out to investigate a mass stabbing incident, which occurred 3 years prior. You can tell it's in the past because it's in 4x3. They follow one of the victims around and begin to notice weird things about him. There's some stuff about UFOs and curses and stuff, you know how it is. Throughout the investigation, they consult with experts about what these omens could mean. Given that a cult takes place in our world, these experts are real people, mainly friends of Shiraishi. I mean, Kiyoshi Kurosawa is in this as himself. So is manga artist Peko Watanabe. It's great. There's a few other cameos like this in Shiraishi's other movies, and I always find them cute. Like, despite having careers, these people are still just a bunch of dorks making things together. I really like it. Don't let the supernatural elements fool you, though. This movie is slow and consists mainly of people talking in cramped rooms. Despite being a theatrically released horror movie, Occult shares more in common with the guerrilla-style content of the early web. There's so much shaky cam footage of people walking around public spaces or eating food, it's enough to feel like a legitimate time capsule of 2009's Tokyo. I've seen a lot of people dismiss Occult as some low-budget oddity with really bad special effects, but I actually think Occult's production value is one of its strengths. Because, surprise, this isn't actually a movie about curses or ectoplasmic worms. Not entirely. It's actually the fictional record of a sad, miserable, lonely NEET, living off cheap convenience store food and sleeping at internet cafes. What is framed as a supernatural investigation is more like, hey, we followed this homeless guy around for a month and realized post-bubble Japanese society is fundamentally fucked. But there's still a horror movie script somewhere in there, so there's the occasional spooky sighting or creepy music track, and, of course, a spoonful of cosmic horror. Even at its tensest points, Occult doesn't shy away from the painfully mundane. There's some pretty grimy stuff in here, but it's all couched in the trivial aspects of daily life. This is something I really love. For almost 2 hours, you're living with these people, you're doing groceries with them, eating dinner with them, handling video equipment with them, all while following this one weird guy. This is, by all definitions, a very boring movie. Boring in the sense that you don't get the kind of thrill you'd expect from a horror movie. It's very slow and very low-key, but there's still a lot going on here. There's really interesting shit regarding this guy and his life. There's weird, spooky stuff regarding his paranormal abilities, there's fun banter, and like with Ju-on, you get to really soak in its urban atmosphere. This might come off as very Thing Japan of me, but it's legit cool to hang out in Tokyo circa 2009 for a while, even if things do go south eventually. To me, Occult is the good kind of boring. Maybe it's because I have the attention span of a Greek philosopher, but I never found boring to be a particularly strong criticism. I think a movie being really slow just isn't the cardinal sin people make it out to be, you know? I think it says more about the critic than it does about the movie, if I'm being honest. but I could totally see someone getting really tired of watching this, so different strokes and all that. That being said, the last third of Occult is nuts. I'll be spoiling it here, but I would still recommend you check out this movie if it sounds cool. If mid-2000s ennui with a sprinkling of Lovecraft sounds interesting to you, or if you're into the feel of old digital video, then this one's a wild ride. Spoiler time. Basically, at a certain point, the weird neat guy reveals that the voices in his head have been telling him to build a bomb and blow up a bunch of people in Shibuya. He's been saving up money for it this entire time. He wants the director to document all of it. Shiraishi refuses at first, but the cosmic demons force his hand, and he ends up actually cooperating with this guy. Yes, there are extended scenes of Koji Shiraishi as himself building a pipe bomb with some random guy, and they still have to eat and do other stuff throughout all of this. They're still just hanging out and filming everything. They, no joke, go to a movie theater and watch Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull at one point. It's hilarious. Well, it would be if it wasn't for the hundreds, if not thousands, of casualties in the near future. Let's call it slice of life. Like Nichijou for Kaczynskis. It's all fun and games, but it goes about as well as you'd expect. Despite the very real and grounded threat of an actual bomb, there's still an element of cosmic horror to it. Something about an afterlife, with Occult's infamous final shot depicting the bomber in hell? Wait, what even is this? Man, this shit is nuts. To say Occult is thematically loaded would be like saying grass is green. There's no sidestepping it. What are the moral obligations of a filmmaker? Is it possible to do harm simply by pointing a camera at someone? How responsible are we, collectively, for the harm done to and by the people on the fringes of society? Is there a merit to spiritualism? Are there things too complex and unknowable for us to ever make sense of? Fellas, is it gay to build a pipe bomb with another man? I'm aware that Occult doesn't really answer these questions, but I think that's okay. I think it's really fucking cool and weird regardless, and I think Occult fits perfectly into the Heisei anxiety canon. In case you don't know what I'm talking about here, well, okay, I'm definitely not the most qualified person to explain any of this, but I'll give it a shot. In simple terms, after the explosion of the asset price bubble, the country entered a depression which fundamentally altered the public psyche. The decade that followed, the 1990s, is widely known as the lost decade, but this economic instability stretches all the way into the 2000s, the lost decades, so to speak. This depression pretty much defined the early Heisei era, and marked a societal turning point heading into the new millennium, the echoes of which are still felt today, well into the Reiwa era. But there's a lot of media produced during the Heisei era that reflects the country's anxieties about the future, the post-bubble malaise plus the rise of telecommunications, Keitai subculture, and the internet were a lot for the younger generation to deal with, especially those who were just entering the workforce. So much fascinating art came about in this period. Media about urban rot, societal ennui, fear of the internet, fear of technology, fear of other people and the things they might do, terrorism, stalking, serial killings, etc. Maybe it's because the 2020s have been a historically disastrous decade globally, but I find this art extremely compelling. I've watched and enjoyed a lot of movies, anime, and games which reflect these fears. I could write an entire segment dedicated to this stuff, given how much it overlaps with J-horror, as well as the Japanese cyberpunk genre as a whole. But it might be a little too much for a single video. Besides, a lot of the movies on this list are kind of about these fears already. Whenever there's societal worry, horror will always be used as a vessel for it, without fail. It's that way now, and it's been that way since the beginning of time. Well, unless they turn you into a franchise and then you're hanging out with Jet Jaguar or Ava Unit 1 or whatever the fuck. Beyond movies, Koji Shiraishi also directed a lot of ghost videos. Is this too unserious of a topic to follow up all the really dark stuff I just mentioned? I'm sorry. Well, he did direct a lot of ghost videos, there's no way around that, and he's really good at it, always managing to add just enough weirdness into the mix to keep me entertained. From directing short cursed videos in the aughts to eventually making the Senritsu Kaiki series in the 2010s, he keeps outdoing himself. As of writing, I've only seen part 1 of the Senritsu Kaiki series, but I hear it goes places. Shiraishi really cut his teeth on Japan's weirdly prolific cursed video market. From TV shows covering the occult to variety segments and ghost hunting shows to tapes and DVDs containing allegedly real ghost footage, there's a lot of this stuff to go over. I was planning to have a really big segment on this, but I ended up canning it. I gotta give a huge shout out to my friend Baxter, who gave me a ton of useful pointers on this stuff, even if I didn't really follow up on them. Sorry, Bax. Like I said, Koji Shiraishi was heavily involved in this scene, and traces of it can be found all throughout his work. One of my favorite examples of this cursed video format, as well as Shiraishi's specific brand of weirdness, is 2008's Ura horror. Unlike occult and Noroi, there are no big thematic through lines here, just a string of scary and occasionally hilarious ghost videos, which range from pants-shittingly scary to almost hypnotic in their awkwardness. I don't have too much to say about Ura horror. Historically, it's been difficult to find this movie online, which has only added to its mystique. Fun fact, some of these videos have floated around as real ghost videos, clipped and out of context, of course. Can you blame people though? It feels as if they were made for that. They have the perfect production value. There's even fake health warnings and shit. The whole thing is awesome. And if you don't mind me spoiling one of these segments, I want to highlight the short where Takashi Shimizu makes a cameo. This one is perfectly emblematic of early 2000s Shiraishi because it starts out as this tongue-in-cheek homage to the Ju-on series, with the real Takashi Shimizu investigating a supposedly real Toshio sighting. It almost feels like an ad for the Ju-on franchise. Like a typical ghost hunting show, it's mostly quiet and kinda goofy. But then, it changes. This segment quickly flies off the rails and we start to realize that this alleged Toshio sighting might not just be a rumor, and that what the neighbors are describing as Toshio from Ju-on is actually something else. Something that happens to resemble Toshio, but is by no means Toshio. It's awesome and it got me real good. Shoutouts Koji Shiraishi. Oh yeah, that reminds me. Shiraishi has directed a lot of weird and obscure stuff, and while there's not nearly enough room here to talk about all of it, I'd like to mention one of my favorite things he's ever done. In 2004, quite early into his career, he is one of the many directors hired to work on Hideshi Hino's Theater of Horrors, which was an anthology collection of 6 short films, all inspired by Hideshi Hino's manga. Hino is one of the most famous horror mangaka out there, with tons of cool shit under his belt and a really appealing style. Oh, and I guess he also directed 2 of the guinea pig movies. No, I'm not showing footage from the fucking guinea pig movies, okay? Alright, you can have a little bit as a treat. Dead Girl Walking is a short film adaptation of the manga Kaiki, Shibito Shoujo, which I believe has not been translated. Just to be clear, this little segment was a last-minute addition and I'm still unclear on some of the details. At first I thought Dead Girl Walking was a loose adaptation of The Living Corpse, another Hino manga. That one is translated. But no, Shibito Shoujo is the actual source material, albeit untranslated. As of writing, I have not skimmed the manga yet, but I'll be sure to append my thoughts once I'm done. I really love this movie. I wasn't going to include it here originally because it's one of those things that's so personally appealing to me, specifically, that I was afraid of, not doing it justice, I guess. But I figured you guys would be robbed of something cool if I didn't mention it, so here we go. It is a perfectly fine and normal day for our girl Yuri, hanging out with her family, getting ready for school, enjoying the morning sun, and watering her flowers. That is until she fucking dies. Yeah, her heart stops beating and her body stops emitting any signs of life, leading doctors to declare her clinically dead. But there's a catch. She's obviously still alive, still able to walk, still able to think and speak. Hence, Dead Girl Walking. Yeah, she's only alive for 3 minutes. Barring the goofy intro, the film actually opens up on a really nice note with gentle piano music and soft lighting. It's, dare I say, pretty? This is shot on early digital video and you can obviously tell, but it manages to be pretty striking regardless. Oh yeah, and the rest of the movie's in black and white, by the way. It looks incredible. You know what they say about black and white. It's the cheat code to making a movie look good. But I genuinely mean it here. I love the way this thing looks. I love the framing and the usage of values. Oh, and I love the way it sounds, too. Owing to the spooky black and white vibe of the whole thing, there's a lot of cheesy mellotron strings and little percussion sounds and other things. It's really sweet. Actually, I found this whole thing to be really sweet in a very melancholic way. It's mostly about this girl walking around for minutes on end, the silence occasionally punctuated by intertitles, dialogue, or bursts of violence. There's also quite a bit of gore. Whenever her body falls apart or rots, you occasionally get splashes of blood or decaying flesh. But most of the 44-minute runtime is spent on these really gentle scenes of her exploring public spaces. It's super mellow. I find it to be really lovely, while still being quite depressing, all things considered. There's an entire freak show bit where people gawk at her like she's a monster. It's dark and disturbing, and I can't help but feel some of that Koji Shiraishi style shining through here. Earlier I talked about the often exploitative nature of horror movies, and I guess this is a pretty overt take on that. It's also a pretty overt take on the concept of bodily autonomy. Everyone, from her family to her ex-friends, to the doctors and the carnies, all objectify her and dehumanize her. People want to do stuff to her. They see her body as free real estate for whatever sick shit they want to subject her to, and I just found it pretty fucking relatable. Sorry, no jokes here. I just really like this thing and I found it really tender. I just want to hug this girl. I want her to water her plants in peace, you know? As for the manga, okay, I actually read both Shibito Shoujo and The Living Corpse since they share so much in common, and man, Hideshi Hito does not disappoint. I haven't read that much of his work, but from the bits I have read, I gotta say, I fucking love this guy. First, The Living Corpse, which shares a ton of elements with Dead Girl Walking. This one's about a goofy-looking zombie guy who's still alive despite not having a single living cell in his entire body. He washes up on a village and spends the first chunk just sort of wandering around, which reminded me a lot of Yoshiharu Tsuge's work. Which isn't to say Hideshi Hino's manga feels even remotely close to being Gekiga. No, there's a lot of stylization and comedy here. Like I said earlier, Hino's work is just really appealing on a visual level. It's so cute and even silly, while still having that gross and creepy factor. The dawning horror of the protagonist slowly coming to terms with his condition, juxtaposed with all the dudes in lab coats freaking the fuck out, not knowing what to do about any of this shit. It's super funny to me. I'm surprised by how much less cruel this is compared to Dead Girl Walking, the movie. Yeah, they experiment on this guy and he eventually escapes, but all throughout there's this sense that people are trying to help him somehow. There's a surprising lack of cynicism in Hideshi Hino's manga. These guys feel genuinely sorry for the zombie man. They even tried to make him artificial skin and help him reintegrate back into society, which obviously doesn't go very well. Eventually, the zombie guy escapes and they stage a manhunt with cops and dogs and newspaper ads everywhere. But he manages to sneak by and slowly piece together information on his past life, which is when he realizes that he was Shinkai Yosuke, a famous explorer who died at sea. Clutching a magical pendant and slowly drowning, he made his last wish, to live long enough to see his family again. As the older scientist describes this, he visibly breaks down in tears, knowing the hell this guy must be going through. It's kind of incredible. When Yosuke finally sees his family again, there's a real sense of melancholy. He loves them so much, and you can tell that Hino's kind of writing about himself at this point, about his love for his own family and the constant frustrations dealing with his work-life balance. Yosuke eventually realizes that his time is running out and that he must say farewell. He returns to the ocean and sinks back into the water where he belongs, as the scientists watch him slowly drift into the distance. This is where it ends, right? Well, sorta. There's actually a few more pages after this, where Yosuke's life flashes before his eyes. You also get to see this afterlife where his body and soul slowly come apart. It's gorgeous. As darkness envelops everything, you get this sudden bright flash of light with the lines, "This is not the end, but the beginning." Then it ends. The afterword basically confirms what I said earlier. You can pause here and read it. You really should. This story was written during a time when Hino was financially struggling and in very poor health. The constant fear of dying and not being able to support his family turned his work into a living hell. I found his words here really touching and relatable. Each time I read through these pages, I cannot help but recall the nightmare that was my life back then. No matter how fortunate I feel myself to be today, I will never forget that I may never have been here at all. Yeah, I get it, man. I really do. The Living Corpse is a fantastic companion piece to Dead Girl Walking, and another reminder that I should probably read more of Hideshi Hino's manga. Again, this bit was a last-minute addition, so it's not as in-depth as it could be, but yeah. How about the actual Dead Girl Walking manga? While I wasn't able to find a translated version of Kaiki Shibito Shoujo, I did find a few raws of it online. If you know kana, you can use the hiragana to slowly read through it, but my Japanese is not on that level yet, so I mainly just stared at the pictures. I had a sneaking suspicion that this would be a very different story from the movie, and yeah, even with my limited understanding, I can tell that it's not even remotely close. Yeah, the basic premise is similar, but they spend a lot more time on the medical side of things. And Yuri's family is much more involved in the story. They also seem a little less hostile. Yeah, they're freaked out at first, but they eventually try to help her. Yuri's mom helps with covering up the wounds, which grows increasingly futile as Yuri's body continues to decay until she's eventually beyond the pale. It's fucking sad. Like, really, really sad. This shit made me cry, and not just a little bit. I'm talking inconsolable baby tears. I was a wreck near the end. It's such a powerful visual analog for the mental and psychological decay of a loved one. If you've ever experienced a deep mental anguish or have known someone in that state, this will probably land with you. It's that feeling of helplessness as you watch someone you love spiral further and further into the void. But this is a Hideshi Hino manga after all, so all of this misery eventually leads into a weirdly beautiful conclusion. I'm not exactly sure what's happening here, but like, look at this shit, man. It's like whatever energy remained in Yuri's body managed to find new life out there, and it's so stupidly gorgeous that I really have nothing else to say beyond, if any of you have a scanlation of this or are willing to make one for the good of humanity, please share it with us. I am begging you. Wow, okay, that was a massive tangent, but I felt it was necessary. I really like this movie, and while I haven't seen every entry in Hideshi Hino's Theater of Horrors, it gets a big recommend from me. I think a bunch of these movies are available on those, Brazilian Google Drive folders online, so go get them. Whew. But that's enough about the early 2000s. It's time we go way back to the past, to watch the scary horror movies that, okay, you get the point. This is where stuff is gonna get a little non-standard, let's just say. But before that, hey, as you can probably imagine, I have a Patreon page. I need money to live, and I'm very, very broke. So any support helps. As some of you already know, I'm currently stuck in this really shitty little town where I basically can't do anything. I really need to get out of here as soon as possible, and your money helps with that. I also want to help my mother, who's disabled, and my family in general, so yeah, I hope you enjoy the video. Okay, can we talk about Lovecraft? I've been dying to talk about Lovecraft. It would be impossible to overstate his influence on Japanese media, not just in horror, but the wider landscapes of fiction, pop culture, fantasy, comedy, and, well, porn. Especially porn. From my understanding, Lovecraft has been quite popular ever since his works got translated into Japanese. But his influence didn't fully take off until the arrival of the Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG, which is way more popular in Japan than it is anywhere else. COC has had a pretty massive influence on a lot of things, mainly video games. RPGs, eroge, visual novels, and other kinds of computer games really found a lot of inspiration in the worlds and mechanics of Call of Cthulhu. I'm definitely not the first one to make this observation, but Japan's love of H.P. Lovecraft is not that surprising when you consider it mainly deals in fear of the unknown, insular ideas about the world, old gods, and, of course, horrors from the sea. All topics which the historically xenophobic island nation of Japan is probably pretty familiar with. Regardless, I think it's super cool to see Lovecraft's weird ideas reinterpreted by foreign artists. They tend to alter the source material in ways I find infinitely more compelling than their original counterparts. Yeah, even though my online slogan is technically a Lovecraft reference, I'm not necessarily his biggest fan. I know, it's pretty much boilerplate at this point to start a piece on Lovecraft by condemning his weird racism, but it's so baked into his writing that you pretty much have to bring it up. I also don't really get much out of his stories. I don't know, cosmic horror just never did that much for me. Like, hey dog, I know the sun doesn't orbit the earth. I know humans are small and weak. So all this fear-mongering about things beyond our comprehension and our supposed insignificance in the vastness of the cosmos leave me waiting like, and what's your point? I don't know. I just don't find it all that scary or even compelling. My favorite examples of cosmic horror usually have less to do with fear of the unknown and more to do with like creating these little puzzle boxes of cryptic imagery and allegory. Cosmic horror is at its best when it strings you along into a bizarre realm, where common sense and human intuition aren't enough to actually piece things together. It has this brain-expanding quality. Lovecraft has a bit of that in places, but then he's also like, oh my god, that Romani woman just looked at me weird. How scary! Which is why I fucking hate Call of Cthulhu. The story, not the game. The original story has some iconic elements, but he spends so long detailing the precise ethnic makeup of the cults he's describing that it drives me insane. It's so frustrating and exhausting, and I wouldn't blame anyone for dropping it. Yeah, I went back and read some of his stories while working on this segment, and I found Call of Cthulhu shockingly miserable. Shadow over Innsmouth, on the other hand, I found to be much more enjoyable. While it suffers from some of the same issues as Cthulhu, there's just something inherently thrilling about a simple story of a guy escaping an evil town. It's much more fun to read and to think about. I think anyone who grew up in an isolated, impoverished, or otherwise rural area will probably understand what I'm talking about. Culture shock is something I find really interesting, and I think it's why Innsmouth begs to be adapted, especially by foreigners who might have a different take on its core themes. Which is why I gotta give a massive shout out to the Japanese TV movie Innsmouth wo Okage. That's right, I was going somewhere with all of this. Produced in 1992 for TBS's Gimme a Break block, Innsmouth is hands down my favorite Lovecraft adaptation. Probably. I mean, I just love this thing. It has all the charm of a cheap TV movie while touching on everything you'd want out of a Lovecraft adaptation, all in under an hour. Somehow balancing the slower psychological elements with some honest-to-God goofball shit. This thing is downright campy in places, which is not to say it's a comedy. There's still a lot of serious dialogue, creepy world building, slow exploration, and careful setup. This was obviously made by Lovecraft nerds who understood the importance of these elements, which really shines through in all the performances. Shiro Sano and Renji Shibashi especially have incredible chemistry as they anxiously discuss Innsmouth lore. Yeah, you know, Innsmouth, Japan, right next to Arkham and Dunwich. What do you mean you've never heard of these iconic Japanese locations? Man, Shiro Sano steals the entire show. He's so good at portraying this no-nonsense, big city photographer, here to do research and shit, while also completely selling all the bug-eyed terror and anxiety of a Lovecraft protagonist. There's this one scene where an obviously evil fishman serves him an obviously evil fish, which is still alive by the way, and it's all intercut with like neon green footage of dubious men noisily eating dubious food, which Shirosano seems genuinely terrified by, lending the entire thing the sense of heightened reality, which is just hysterical. That neon light is there throughout the whole thing, by the way, for whenever something fishy is going on. But really, we all know that it's there to highlight all the cool prosthetics they made. And like, I get it, they look awesome, it's such a fun touch. These were designed by makeup and special effects artist Shinichi Wakasa, who worked on a bunch of Heisei-era tokusatsu like Godzilla Final Wars and Ultraman Tiga. Shadow over Innsmouth has no guys in rubber suits, but it has really weird-looking fishmen, which is the next best thing. The villagers are cool, but I think my favorite design in the entire movie is this one scene in the final shot, as well as the poster. The protagonist, but with a fishy makeover. He's got fake gills and stuff, it rules. It's such a wonderfully creepy way to close this out while still being pretty tongue-in-cheek all things considered. Which, like I said, is emblematic of this entire movie. Visually and tonally, it's really basking in its genre. This goes for the music too. Creepy and atmospheric, but also very spooky, if that makes sense. There's this like repeating flute motif. Is it a flute? I can't quite tell with woodwinds. There's this repeating flute motif that plays whenever something eerie happens, and you hear it so many times throughout this movie. It kind of reminds me of the musical stingers from old Universal horror movies or something. It feels really classic. Oh, I guess they also play Paint It Black here, like the Rolling Stones song. At least it sounds like it, I'm not sure. Boy, I hope this video doesn't get claimed. Hey, pop quiz. What do Serial Experiments Lain and the Innsmouth movie have in common? Cosmic horror? Yeah, that's one thing. A lot of slow scenes of people traversing urban environments with little to no dialogue? That's also true. Oh, and I guess they were written by the same fucking guy. Boom! How's that for trivia? I say written because, despite being credited as director on most English sites, Japanese sources cite Jun Nasuda as the movie's actual director. He's even listed on the streaming site this movie's on. Yeah, this movie's on streaming, by the way. There, I corrected a minor mistake about an obscure Japanese movie on the internet. Do I get my own Wikipedia entry now? Is someone gonna fix this Letterboxd page and credit me for it? No? Oh, I see. I guess that's okay. Now that I mentioned the obvious, I'd like to note that Chiaki Konaka is a very prolific writer, not just in anime, but in film and TV as well. He's also a prolific crackpot, but that's an entirely different topic. Well, actually, it depends, because I feel like you can probably draw a through line connecting his paranoid dissociative style of writing to whatever weird politically conservative niche he eventually fell into, although I really don't feel like getting into that right now. Regardless, you'll know a Konaka script when you see one. He writes very slow, deliberate stories with sparse and elliptical dialogue, and he's got a big knack for realism. Even when writing anime, it often feels like he's writing for flesh and blood actors rather than animated characters. Oh, and he really likes H.P. Lovecraft. Like really likes H.P. Lovecraft. I suppose you know this already since he wrote the Innsmouth movie we just talked about, and its novelization, but he's always cramming in Lovecraft references to pretty much everything he works on. His writing just oozes that Lovecraftian vibe. Ugh, does anyone else hate describing things as oozing something? Isn't it kind of gross? Like it's oozing pus or something? Or semen? You can see all of these Konaka-isms in his anime work, but I'd argue they're at their strongest in his film and TV work. I debated where in the video to put this. There's a pretty famous Japanese slasher movie from the 80s called Evil Dead Trap. No, it's not related to Evil Dead, at least I don't think so. But it's a pretty important movie, considered to be a pivotal moment in the history of Japanese horror film. The basic premise is this. You have a bunch of TV staff and camera crew running around a warehouse, investigating the origins of a creepy snuff video which they got in the mail. As they search, a mysterious murder man picks them off one by one. Pretty typical, I know, but there's a weird amount of giallo influence in this movie, with the color palette and cinematography. There's also a really freaky looking ghost baby. And the protagonist looks like she's from a Kenji Eno game, but that's besides the point. Well, when it came time to make a sequel, they got my boy Chiaki J. Konaka to write the script for it. I mean, who else would you get? Konaka played it safe, of course, and wrote a pretty typical horror movie script, which was basically more of the same. No, I'm just fucking with you. This movie's buck wild. Evil Dead Trap 2 bears so little resemblance to the first one that I'm opting to call it Hideki instead, to avoid direct comparison. While the first one certainly has its surreal moments, Hideki is a completely unadulterated psychosexual nightmare of a film. It's so loaded with strong imagery that it's mentally taxing just to think about. I wasn't even gonna include it here originally, but it kind of felt like I had to. I want to note here that I made the mistake of watching Hideki at 4 a.m. I was fine at first, but I started dissociating halfway through, and by the end, my brain was just mush. So consider this a vague and somewhat painful recollection. I'm trying my best here. I'm scrubbing through my MP4 file of the movie right now, and it's shocking just how much they packed into this one. Which is not to say this movie is fun, or that it's a roller coaster. Let me clarify. This movie is not fun, it's not fun-y, it's ultra-violent, painful, elliptical, disturbing, slow, quiet, and anxious as all hell. But I'm well aware that by saying that, a good 20% of you started rubbing your hands like gremlins. Hideki predates these, but for the sake of comparison, I want to say that it's like if someone took Love and Pop and Serial Experiments Lain, saw their themes of isolation, female suffering, trauma, and said, Nah, but for real though, and chuck them into a blender with a bunch of 80s slasher movies. And you bet your ass it's got all those trademark konaka moments, with all the slow walking and quiet shots of urban environments, really drilling in those oppressive feelings of decay and isolation. The protagonist of Hideki is a bit different from the first movie's TV host. She's a film projectionist for one. She's also awkward, lonely, and very sexually frustrated, which the movie is largely about. Oh yeah, I should warn you here that there's some scenes of essay in Hideki, so be warned. But if you're a big konaka head, then this is a must-watch. In all fairness, I'm not even sure if I like Hideki. I really don't know what to make of it. I suppose that's something that happens a lot when making these videos. You find something strange you feel really compelled to talk about, but you don't really know what to say about it. So you spend a while trying to write something, hoping that there'll be some kind of substance beneath the words. Oh, and there's anime girls and cum jokes too, I guess. Speaking of weird movies that I probably don't have much to say about, but I'm compelled to mention regardless. In 1988, Konaka and Teriyoshi Ishii made one of the first mockumentaries. Psychic Vision Jaganrei is a really convincing fake TV report about an idol who's working on the promo tour for her next big single. A song called... Oh, Konaka, you're not even trying now. The idea here is that this TV report was never broadcast, so we're watching a stitched together version from a bunch of different tapes. You know that thing I said earlier about occult feeling like a genuine glimpse at mid-2000s Tokyo? Where the horror elements occasionally take a backseat to like footage of guys eating and talking and shit? Well, Jaganrei is kind of like that, but for Japan's bubble period. Check it out! It's the 80s, baby. City pop, salarymen, imported fashion, Memphis style, and super plasticky idols. There's this boardroom meeting early on in the movie that feels so candid in a way I wasn't expecting, and the movie's largely made up of stuff like this. It's incredibly grounded and realistic, which makes sense considering it's mainly about the idol industry, which is, of course, a very real thing, even if some of us wish it wasn't. I know that media about the evils of the idol industry has about the same impact as, like, political cartoons from the Bush era, but for 1988, I want to say this was probably pretty fresh, and I think it's really engrossing. There's a lot of time spent on the logistics of getting a song out to the masses. There's meetings, interviews with producers, recording sessions, photo shoots, and even singing lessons. Yeah, this was around the point where I was pretty much sold on this whole thing. I love how vulnerable this part feels. This is a spooky ghost movie from the 80s, yet we spend so much time just like living in this time capsule. Like with a cult, there's definitely a type of guy out there who's eager to label this as boring, but we don't do that shit here. Jaganrei is only 50 minutes, and I was glued to the screen the whole time. But then again, I'm also severely mentally ill, so I just get fixated on shit like this. Wow. So stylish. So chic. Go get 'em, girl. Oh. Oh no. I can play this song right. It's not a real song. I mean, this movie was co-produced by Pony Canyon, but I can play Lovecraft for you guys, right? It's a banger. I swear, if this gets copyright claimed, I'm rioting. While mainly a slow mockumentary, they really pop off near the end. I don't want to spoil it, so I'll just note that it got me good. The last fourth of Jaganrei goes from 1 to 100, and it rules. It's so upsetting in the best way possible, and a big recommend. Barring a few things. There's some really freaky special effects here too. Oh yeah, I know I said Chiaki Konaka wrote Psychic Vision Jaganrei, but he's much more than a writer. He worked on the VFX and pretty much every other aspect of the movie minus directing. That's something he's noted in interviews, and I'm inclined to believe him. I think people tend to forget that these projects are a collaborative process, and nobody's 100% fixed to one role, unless we're dealing with like a really massive team of people. Plus, Psychic Vision Jaganrei is V cinema. If you couldn't tell by the fact it's 50 minutes long, and that it's in 4:3, and that it has tits in the first 30 seconds, we love to see it. You can't be too precious working on things like this, because otherwise you risk not getting it out the door in time, to a market that was rapidly expanding and changing. Speaking of straight-to-video horror, I'm a bit fascinated by just how many American gore movies made their way to Japan. Splatter cinema had a massive influence on J-horror during the 80s. There's a lot, and I'm not just talking about the guinea pig movies. I'll admit, it was very tempting to pad this video out with a bunch of scuzzy OVAs and splatter movies, but I didn't really feel like doing that, and editing around all that blood would have been a nightmare. But the 80s were the gore zone. Spurred on by hobby magazines like V-Zone and the lingering popularity of classic tokusatsu still airing on TV, nerdy basement dwellers all across Japan got really into special effects. And who can blame them? This stuff is fun. There's so much crazy experimentation you can do with fake gore. From trying out different blood recipes to making gross fake eyeballs, it rules. This was a healthy, thriving subculture for a while, until, okay, this is mainly a borrowed observation, and there's definitely other factors at play, but it's not hard to blame the media circus around the Miyazaki murders, plus all the weird conservative posturing around the word otaku for this sudden withdrawal of this subculture. It's why hobbyist magazines like V-Zone pretty much vanished off the face of the earth. Collecting this type of media, being into this hobby, labeling yourself as a horror/gore otaku became very taboo, which is a shame because we got a lot of genuinely cool shit out of this space. For example, V-Zone made a whole ass movie, which was heavily advertised in the magazine itself, all over the place. Guzo, The Thing Forsaken by God, Part 1, which never got a Part 2 because the magazine went kaput, is a 40-minute VHS horror movie from 1986, with all sorts of dark, hideous creatures, and the most bone-chilling jump scares this side of just kidding. It's actually a wholesome good time. Yup, another one of those movies where quote-unquote nothing happens. Just a bunch of besties hanging out, playing card games, relaxing at the pool, having sleepovers. But be careful. Watch out! It's a creepy tentacle! Just in case you forgot about the titular thing forsaken by God, there's occasional shots of it throbbing and writhing, but not enough to distract you from the largely chill atmosphere and soulful landscapes. Beautiful. I'm so thoroughly charmed by this movie, it's almost obnoxiously cute to me, even though I know for a fact it will bore some of you to tears. But isn't that what you came here for? To hear Maria's insane film opinions? To be subjected to my schizoid ramblings? Yeah, that's right. More tentacles! Don't be fooled. Things get pretty scary in, like, the last third of the movie. Owing to its gore otaku pedigree, there's some pretty awesome effects here. The tentacles are used to great effect, but there's some really gnarly shots of the monster. It's gross, in a good way. The final sequence is awesome and creepy and gross and exactly what you'd expect from a thing called The Thing Forsaken by God. Why, ain't that the cutest little turtle you ever seen? Or tortoise? I forget. Boy, I sure hope I don't get called out in the comments for my lack of turtle knowledge. Maybe Guzo Part 2 will clear things up for me. Oh wait, that's never happening. Oops. Like I said earlier, I think the taboo aspect really put a damper on this kind of stuff. But beyond that, I just don't think the 90s were really the decade for this type of movie anymore. Things were about to get way more introspective, slow, and paranoid. And you can see this as early as Shadow over Innsmouth. Yeah, that was a TV movie with goofy fish monsters and all that, but a lot of it kind of feels like a meta-commentary on Japanese society, using the xenophobic horror of Lovecraft to hold a mirror up to 90s Japan. That feeling of aimlessness and cognitive dissonance and almost a sense of self-loathing oozing from this gross little town. It's a transition of sorts. There's a pretty huge difference between 80s and 90s Japanese horror movies. Another contributing factor is that I actually don't think horror is even all that popular in Japan to begin with. But I have almost no evidence to back that up aside from like some interviews with certain directors, so who knows? Which is why I'm really happy to say that I found a movie which sort of bridges all these eras. A movie with the grimy VHS feel of the 80s, but spread across nearly 2 decades of production and post-production. A movie with the intimacy and hamminess of a student project, the lo-fi aesthetics of Super 8 film, and the crazy mixed media chops of a genuine passion project. Bloody Muscle, Bodybuilder in Hell is an independent film made over the course of 15 years by mostly one guy, Shinichi Fukusawa. But let's take it from the top. Naoto, the titular bodybuilder, is randomly contacted by his ex-GF, Mika, who needs help for an article she's writing on haunted locations. A long time ago, Naoto showed her a photo of this old haunted house, which piqued her interest. Given that this house is now Naoto's property, his father's inheritance, it makes sense that they would both travel there. So, with the help of the slick-looking psychic Mizuguchi, they set out to uncover whatever dark secrets this place may hold, and yeah, there's no obfuscation here. Naoto's dad did some really fucked up stuff here a few decades ago, which may or may not have spawned an evil curse on this house. Whoops! And Naoto's dad looked exactly like Naoto, so if any evil ghosts were to show up, they would definitely mistake Naoto for his dad. Well, ain't that curious? By the way, it's here that I'd like to note that Bloody Muscle is a blatant tribute to Sam Raimi's Evil Dead. This is the only time I'll be mentioning that, since it's like the one fact everyone knows about this movie, and it's a bit played out, but yeah, they directly quote a bunch of stuff from the first two Evil Dead movies, so it would be weird not to mention it. Bloody Muscle, Bodybuilder in Hell is an insane fucking movie, but Fukuzawa does establish a pretty serious atmosphere in the first half. Yeah, it's made with the budget of like a pack of chewing gum, but I gotta respect it, you know. There's some vibes here, some honest-to-God mood. The really deliberate blocking and framing combined with the psychic's dead serious veneer do a lot to convey that ghostly ambiance. Mizuguchi's actor is so fucking good throughout this thing. The fairly restrained and serious performance of the first chunk gives way to the absolute lunacy of the second half. After getting possessed, Mizuguchi becomes a demonic grimacing freak, chewing up as much scenery as humanly possible, covered in so much fake blood. The rest of the movie is basically a really protracted bumble fight between Naoto and the possessed Mizuguchi. Just two guys stumbling around and beating the piss out of each other, which dips into like some real Three Stooges shit, I swear to God. They have the on-screen chemistry of fucking Tom and Jerry, it owns. This is blended with some genuinely tense little moments and scares, but nothing I write here can do any justice to the experience of actually watching this movie. There is so much, for the lack of better words, gobsmacking bullshit that happens in these 60 minutes of Bloody Muscle. It's an almost religious experience. It goes so fucking hard, dude. I absolutely love it. This movie was in development hell for a long-ass time. Fukuzawa started writing it in 1995, but shooting took nearly 8 years. They had to reshoot almost the entire thing. Due to scheduling conflicts and Fukuzawa having no money, this was a long and arduous process. Then, the post-production, digitizing and treating the film, editing, etc., took almost equally long. The lack of money and resources meant that getting this thing out the door was an almost impossible task. Even after it was finished in like 2009, it took another 2-ish years to find a distributor. To say this was a passion project would be a colossal understatement. And Fukuzawa did it, somehow. And this is on top of doing most of the work himself, hand animating all the stop-motion sequences, the works. I can't help but kind of identify with the guy. I think anyone who's worked their ass off to get something off the ground will find his story deeply relatable. Nothing I've ever endured compares to what making Bloody Muscle, Bodybuilder in Hell must have been like, but there's something about seeing all the effort reflected in the final product that speaks to me. It's this intricate, tangible thing, this messy, passionate, visceral manifestation of pure creativity. It's spooky, funny, goofy, and a little cutesy. It's really beautiful. Oh, and I guess the cute possessed girl helps too. Thanks for posing for the thumbnail, darling. I guess this is a really personal thing, but since I'm almost done with the video, I think it's about time I do that thing YouTubers do where they get overly emotional about some shit nobody cares about. Plus, this has been a long time coming. I spent a significant amount of my childhood learning about practical effects and filmmaking as a whole. Me and my brother used to watch tons of monster movies. We would watch and read tutorials on how to make prosthetics and fake blood and all sorts of stuff. My brother had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of classic horror films, horror directors, special effects artists, and actors. We used to shoot crappy little short films on whatever cheap cameras we could get access to. We used to daydream about making a movie someday, or making a Nightmare on Elm Street fan film, or some shit like that. We used to make fake blood and put it on these shitty Halloween costumes we'd built. I still remember what it tasted like. I still remember the little jugs of liquid latex we bought, hoping to someday make something with them. We never really did. He's still alive, by the way. This isn't me leading up to some reveal that my brother died or something. But, Let's just say that he's not really looking to make movies anymore. Life caught up to us, and, well, it's hard to make ends meet nowadays, so I understand his shifting priorities. But I have not let go of those dreams, of course. I never have and never will. As you can probably tell by the fact that I'm making YouTube videos despite not really belonging in this space, not really having anything insightful to say, not really knowing anything at all, and being a pretty stupid fucking person, all things considered, with no money and no future. You can probably tell that it's hard for me to say no to creative outlets. Once I set my mind on something, it never goes away, be it music, art, writing, anything. It's impossible for me to ever let go of those feelings. People love to grow up all the time and forget their passions, because we live in a world which is increasingly reluctant to afford us the space to express ourselves. You grow up, get a job, and then just survive. It sucks. Which means that those of us who struggle with those adult milestones, those of us who are almost entirely focused on making pointless stuff for the enjoyment of others, are relegated to a little corner, where we lead these clandestine little lives, living from whatever money we can scrounge up. Some people manage to stay on the surface. Others fall between the cracks. Sometimes I get very close to falling between those cracks. But despite all of this, I promise you that I will never let go of all the stupid, pointless, trivial, childish bullshit that fueled me during those summers. Because I'm literally physically unable to repress it. What I'm saying is, I'm going to make a movie someday. I'm going to make 10, 20, 30 movies. Not on a whim, even if most of my projects are born from random whims, but because I need to. I need to make some kind of a movie. I need to make a weird, sad, scary, beautiful, ugly movie that people are going to hate, that people are going to love. I can't make a movie right now. I'm not going to be able to make it for a long time because I can barely afford to pay the bills and because I'm so tired. But there is so much in my stupid, ugly heart that I want to get out there. And every time I watch and write about movies, I'm reminded of this dream. Every time I watch something strange and confusing. Every time I watch something vast and beautiful. It, no joke, makes me feel alive. It makes me want to create something of my own. I'm reminded of summer, of weird daydreams, and the sweet taste of fake blood. Hey, I hope you had a good time watching this. I know it took a while, but you know how it is. Here's the part where I clarify a few things, I guess. I know that this is by no means a comprehensive history of J-horror or whatever, nor was it intended to be that. If you want an intro to J-horror, then I recommend you check out the book by the same name, which I read while working on this project. It's pretty great. It has a whole chapter on Japanese underground theater and other cool stuff like that. I'm also well aware that these are by no means the most obscure or weirdest movies out there, and that this list is actually quite small, all things considered. I could have included tons of other things here, but I think obscurity for obscurity's sake is a tad boring. I'm just one woman writing, narrating, and editing these things. There comes a point where you just have to call it. Also, like I said, J-horror is a very narrow term, and it's maybe not the best term to use for these movies. It's a tad orientalist and dated. I'm mixing terminology here a bit since J-horror is just a useful shorthand. I'm sorry. Also, despite the catchy titles and thumbnails, I've been trying to go beyond the wacky Japan shtick that people love to do. Yeah, I know I'm calling this video something like weird Japanese horror movies, but I tried to infuse it with a little bit of meaning beyond that. Besides, like I've said in the past, these things we see as weird are also seen as weird in their country of origin. These are genre movies made by enthusiasts. They're meant to be scary and a little fucked up. This isn't about weird Japan. This is about creative individuals making cool things. These movies are in conversation with the rest of culture and they don't exist in a vacuum. I hope that the stuff I talked about here gets you curious at least, and that it'll be a fun jumping off point if you're so inclined. Some of these movies are a bit harder to access, but you can find a lot of them on the Internet Archive or on YouTube. You might have to resort to Google Drive links or certain Discord servers, but yeah. Also, you will encounter language barriers, and I advise you get used to it. And don't be weird towards all the Brazilian people subtitling these movies and sharing them with everyone. Just be nice to the people ripping and subbing obscure movies in general. You should cherish these resources because they're always at risk of disappearing. Subbing groups disband, physical media decays, and sites like the Archive are facing constant legal bullshit from publishers and distributors. We need to cherish these things.